Osferth. He smiled, and Osrith smiled too. And with him, Sihtric. Take the men with you over there, and I will climb, he said, and gave Osrith a quick smile, and behind her she saw Berg and another merson. 2 others, then 3 came behind until she had her warriors again. He is with Uhtred, Sihtric told her, before Osrith had asked the question. Below them, the gate groaned. Sihtric had done his work, and it wasn't long until a stream of mercen warriors were pushing, fighting, hitting, and kicking their way into Lundin. Come on, Elfkin called to his commander, raising a hand to pat the jewel that she had once given to him for his wife, now back in Osrith's own hair. But instead, Osrith sat with her back to the wooden wall. She could not yet. And she flung her Wilton livery, the white horse on the red field, over the rampart, where it was hacked to pieces by the mercenaries below. And they waited, her warriors, Elfkin and Oshir, Egelfrith and Falkbald. It was something Osrith would remember with pride when she was an old woman, with her grandchildren about her, how her men had so respected her they had waited. When they did come down, there were mercenaries all over the city, fighting West Saxons and pushing them back towards the north bank of the Thames, to Billingsgate and further, until they came down into the water. Where is he? Osrith said, under her breath. Where is he? And he was there, along with more of the men she loved. The fighting waned, and there was the king of both Mercia and Wessex, standing over the bridge with a kingdom on either side of him. A blue cloak, not the blue of Domhnall's, but the blue of the sky hung from his shoulders. In the hands of one of his attendants, Alfred's crown was being gripped, its emeralds glinting in the afternoon sun. What is he doing? Oshir asked. They all looked as a man in chains had been brought before Aethelstan. Osrith pushed forward, and she was standing with her men 10 feet from the bridge. Aethelstan was making a declaration. As I rise, so does this man, Aethelstan told them. He is released from slavery and is a free man. But then he broke off, for, to his right, a man muscled through. It was Walmond. He was coming through at pace, pushing and knocking warriors and the populace of London out of the way. In his hand was a spear. When he got to the bridge, he began to pick up speed and he leveled his spear, so it was horizontal. And then he brought his arm back. He's going to kill Aethelstan. Osrith's mind screamed. He's going to kill the king. It was as if all of the air had been taken out of the world as Walmond ran. But, at the last second, something opposed him. And, as she looked, Osrith realized it was not something, but someone. It was Uhtred. Osrith's brother threw himself at the giant of man, which was not enough to floor him, but to divert the trajectory of his spear throw. When it came, it whistled past Aethelstan and his counselors on the bridge but landed without harm in the river. The fight was tremendous. No one seemed to move, or want to, as the combat took place. Walmond had unsteadied Uhtred, who had landed awkwardly, but he was using his agility to outfox the man, turning before Walmond could turn. But his injuries were causing issues, and more than once he twisted awkwardly and his feet skidded across the dry earth beside the river. Walmond was using his sword like a club and trying to swat the too quick Uhtred. A gasp came from men who were nearer the duel. Uhtred had rolled away from a thump and had just missed having his head smashed in. Osrith surged forward, but was held back by Elfkin. Don't, Captain, he told her. Don't try. So she watched as Uhtred again narrowly missed death, swinging himself round and slashing at Walmond's ankles. The West Saxon stumbled but did not fall, and Uhtred caught the man's hand with then blade of his sword. Several fingers flew from the man's hand and Walmond roared in pain, and Osrith thought of the poor, humble fisherman of Uhtred's who had been subjected to worse. But then he stopped. Something had caused Uhtred to come to a stop. It was the river. Walmond was backing him into the river. So Osrith could understand completely her brother's next move. But he didn't make it. He slid between Walmond's legs, but the man had anticipated this, and Uhtred was sprawled out in front of him. Walmond pulled him up to his knees. This time Osrith did push forward and got closer to the fight, Elfkin beside her. And then she saw him. She saw her son beside Finan, and her husband was whispering something in young Finan's ear. It took a matter of minutes, though to Osrith it felt like centuries, for young Finan to raise the sword he was using and deliver the killing stroke. As he in turn was raising his arm to deliver the killing stroke to Utad, the sword found the gap in his armor, and young Finan drove it home with a ferocity that made Osrith proud. There was a thump, and Ethelastan's would-be assassin was, himself, dead. Osrith could not help herself. She laughed. Small chuckles to begin with, it rose to guffaws until she was laughing so hard tears were coming to her eyes. Elfkin turned, and her brother was a cocky, arrogant shit. He had planned this and still allowed it to go on, knowing how Ormond had beaten him. Elfkin looked at her, and then back to Utad, who was being helped to his feet by Ethelstan. The common touch, Osrith thought, helping up his allies to his feet. Then, he saw Osrith. How he knew it was her, she did not know, but the keen eyes looked at hers, telling her that she had been seen. My people, Ethelstan said, returning to the center of the bridge, his blue cloak blowing in the breeze. I have defeated my enemies. My brother is dead, killed when sieging my men at Aylesbury. All of my usurpers are dead, except one. He looked at Osrith again, and then she saw. Young Finan was being dragged to the side of the river, one of Ethelstan's men beside him. He had a sword. No. This time Osrith did scream, but Elfkin took her arm. No, Osrith. He hissed urgently, it's, but Osrith had struggled free and was striding towards them, her hand moving to buoy. Look, Captain. Elfkin tried again, and this time she watched as her husband strode across the bridge and stood before Ethelstan. No. Finan's voice came loud and clear. The hush came again. There will be no killing. He looked across to young Finan, his eyes softening in a way Osrith had never before. She thought he was about to turn back and stand beside Utad, but he had not finished. The potential executioner stood still, his hand on his halfway drawn sword. I am Finan, of the family Conchobar, rightful king of the Ullaid, Lord of Berwick. Finan declared to them all, this boy is mine, my own blood, and I am married to his mother. And this time, he looked to Osrith, his eyes wide and bright, like the Finan she had known when she was much younger. Osrith smiled back, though more in astonishment than anything else. He is claimed, and there will be no more talk of fathers. And Finan waited until Ethelelm released young Finan, who walked across to his father, who took his arm. It was the law, Osrith knew. If a man claimed a child, then it was his. Young Finan was Finan mac Finan ui Conchobar, and no longer had the suspicion of being Edward's bastard son. How long do we wait for the coronation? She heard Eswi asking beside her, and he smiled back when Osrith looked at him, with a look that said, they knew what they were doing. They knew what they wanted to do with all the braveness and stupidity of men, Osrith thought. But she looked across to them anyway, and to answer Eswi's question, it was then, just then, a priest had been called. From his attire he looked to be a bishop, and he had been given the crown of Wessex. Before all of you today, Mersins, West Saxons, East Anglians, the bishop was saying, I proclaim you, Ethelstan Rex, to be their king. He raised the crown over Ethelstan's head, and, of the dominions of Cornwall, sent, the 5 counties. He hesitated, and his next words were almost imperceptible. But they were there, and Northumbria. So he had claimed it, Osrith thought, but did not hold it yet. 88,888,888 sin brought her back under the bridge as the coronation finished, and the royal party had left. She looked up, hoping to see Finan and young Finan, but they had gone. I came because I thought you would need me, Osrith said to her husband's look of surprise and lack of surprise when it was they, Utad beside him, Elfkin beside her, had caught up with her with Trinity waiting. I will get to Berwick before you and Finan Beeg, she told him. Finan looked at her, doubtfully, and after the biggest embrace, where Finan hugged them both to him, Eswi had taken her across to Domhnall's ship. We will, Sin told her, confidently when she told him this. We are escorting the trading ships, we will fly like the wind, over the water, as we came, fast like the holy dove. Comsil, Osrith thought. We will get your home, Kalag. And her heart softened, and she smiled at Sin. Only Sainit called her that. Don't you know us? Sin asked, when they were underway. We are Sainit's kin. The better part of his family, Picts, he added. You are getting to your kin and we are your kin too. It will be good that you are apart for a while, Eswi told Osrith, as he declined the invitation to join them in Trinity. I will come when I can. Before Osrith could ask what made it so he could talk about herself and Finan like that, Eswi explained that it was because of Utad, the plague in the north that broke out. He told Osrith, it has killed Sigdriga and his children. His grandchildren are presumed dead, Eswi added. But Osrith detected a twinkle in his eye as he said this. In fact, it was probably his own idea to bring them to Dunnottar and hide them as Ealasad's grandchildren. And his own wife, Eswi told Osrith. But he does not know, yet. You saved my life, Osrith of Beric, Ethelison had acknowledged, before she had left. And though you are in Mercia, and I told you not to come back to my land, I only ever stayed on the south bank of the Thames, she lied. North was Mercia. And she knew Ethelistan had a thing about sticking to his promises, particularly regarding Osrith being in Mercia. So I do stand by my oath that your people will not be harmed when I take the whole of the British island. It was the first step Ethelistan had told her, become king and take the land. Now Alba was in his sight and he had an alliance with Owain of Strathclyde. How funny, then, that they had lived 10 years before, as neighbours in Gwynedd and Tamworth. As Osrith looked out onto the sea, as blue as Ethelistan's coronation cloak, desperation in her stomach began to gnaw, that longing to be back in Dunnottar. Beside Constantine, back to the northern sea. Ethelistan had no right to Alba, he barely had rights to Northumbria. And so then it was that her side was chosen for her by her alliance to the people who had nurtured her, kept her safe when they had no reason at all to do this. It had mattered in the end. It would put her on the opposite side to Finan, for Utad could only choose one side as well, and that would be for the king of the Angles and the Saxons. Finan was right, peace was just a breathing space between war, where repairs were done, promises made, the next generation of warrior conceived, alliances reforged. You might well be from Mercia again today, Ethelistan told her. But, will you bow to me, Osrith of Beric, as your king? No, Osrith told him. I will bow to no one. Then you will leave my land immediately. Constantine took alliance with Ethelelm, he told Osrith. He will bend or Alba will burn. And when I get north, Beric will not be spared. You may try, Osrith told him, but it is my land. My faith with Mercia is ended, for you intend to invade my lands. That hit him. Ethelistan paused almost imperceptibly before nodding for Osrith to continue. It is true, Lord King, said Finan, who had been standing next to her throughout the exchange. My wife is the lady of the lands of Montbridge and of Cumberland and Rust. I have seen the documents. In fact, Finan had the documents with him, both the deed of land for Gwyddolf and of Guthard, and he showed both Utad and Ethelistan these before handing them back to Osrith. Then I will sail with the crew to Alba, Osrith said. Will you come with me, Finan Ma tilde²? Not today, Finan said. Eadith is dead, his family are dead, he will need me, especially with the new mouths to feed who he has sent north. Take our son back to where he is safe. They both looked across to young Finan, however, who was showing his blade off to Sihtric and Berg. Osrith shook her head. But her son insisted, even though the look in his eye was one of disappointment, that he would come with her. But Osrith took his hand. Go with your father, Osrith told him. I have taught you all I can. And beside young Finan, Utad strode. You saved my life, boy, his uncle told him. So I would be happy that you are in my household. We need a ... What do you call yourself? Scaliox. Eliached, uncle, young Finan told him. My lord of Bibbenberg, Utad corrected. Yes, uncle, young Finan replied. He is to learn sword skill, Osrith told Utad. Don't let him use too much of his time with Ijul. Your younger nephew will teach him, Utad said, and a look came across his face which Osrith took to mean that he was thinking about his elder son, Bishop of Seaster, Bishop Oswald. He had been Utad, once, had that name given to him by his father and then had it taken away from him in his father's fury. Thank you, for keeping him safe, no matter how you feel about me. It was just as Sin was helping her over the taffrail that she felt a hand on her shoulder. How do I feel about you? Came Utad's question. You hate me, Osrith told him, simply. I don't hate you, Utad told her, sorrow in his face. When I knew I had a sister, when Father Bika told me about you, I was overcome with joy. Osrith shook her head. And I had escaped to Alba, where I was taken in, as you were taken in with Earl Ragnar, she replied. But I came to find you, in Winchester. But, I saw you before that. I watched you, Utad, at Wittenberg. You had Sir Brigt's head and you held it up and swore to overthrow our Uncle Elfric. Osrith shook her head again. I watched you. I was a child then, and I watched for you every day because I wanted you to come back. Osrith lowered her voice. And Elfric swore me as a bride to Svenkjartansen for Kjartan's loyalty. I was 10. At this, she was sure Utad gave a shudder. Father Bika told me this, he said. I never thought it was true. Whenever did Bika lie? Osrith asked. And she told him of her escape to Pitland, fighting against Ivar's men, saving Constantine's lie and exile in Ireland. The second time I was nearly murdered. I was tied to a rock in a cave as the tide came in. Constantine ran too. I thought he was scared but he had gone to get help. The water was above my mouth before he swam to rescue me. Osrith shook her head. It was keeping her from screaming out, from crying. She needed to tell Utad this. She needed to have him hear it. Those two Irish boys ... They taunted us, they terrorized us, they set traps for us, they tied me down and tried to rape me. But after coming back dripping wet, Constantine finally told Domhnall, who saved my life. He went to the boys' father and threatened their lives. I don't know if that's the reason the blood feud began. Maybe it inflamed it. Let's hope those bastards are food for the crows now, Utad exclaimed. And in the telling, the years of woe and angst were slipping away from her, and she felt light and happy. One is, said Osrith, laughing, the other made him so. The other is very much alive. I will kill him, declared Utad, forcefully. But Osrith threw back her head and laughed again. You won't. And I have had too many chances myself and not done it. Why ever not? Utad asked, hotly. Who between us could kill Finan? And after a look over his shoulder, and a brief nod from his dearest friend, Osrith told Utad about coming to find him, in Wessex, AMD having to find a living. For a long time I was angry at you for the life you had, angry at my mother for marrying Elfric, then dying, angry at Bika, for he knew of me, knew I was alive but never sent for me. Osrith placed a conciliatory hand on Utad's shoulder. I know you have found your peace, my brother, but I never did. I am not at peace. He looked across to Aethelstan, who seemed to have found some lords to speak to. And he will be in Alba before long. He bent to Osrith for a moment. Constantine should submit, he advised. Will Aethelstan submit should Constantine invade? Osrith asked. And then she boarded, after a tight embrace with her husband that told her that he really would not be far behind, and began her long journey home. 88,888,888. You let her go? Utad asked. She will be back at our farm doing what she does best, Finan assured Utad. I do not have to worry about my wife's honor. Utad creased his head, doubtfully. I wouldn't be too sure, he reminded Finan. Domhnall, Constantine, they mean nothing to me. I have my son, and he has been acknowledged. And it wasn't he who was taking the former slave Benedetta to his home, Finan noticed, with Eadith waiting for him at Bibbenberg. And he calls me the fool, Finan thought, for I could never shame Osrith like that, nor she me. She waited for me, Finan told him. Yes, she married Constantine's cousin, and I can't blame her for that. She needed security for Finan Beak. It was a few minutes before they spoke again, on the way, as they were, to the palace. You know Constantine calls him by his dead son's name? Yes, Finan nodded. And if he plays his luck well, would it not be grand that my son becomes king of Alba one day? Utad stopped walking and stared at Finan. You are joking, Surely he just avoided becoming king of England. No, I am indeed serious. What with Osrith's claim to Cumbraland and Strathclyde, he added. For it had been the agreement that he had made with Constantine, when he had gone to ask him to agree for him to wed her. Young Finan was kin, and Constantine wished him to be acknowledged throne-worthy. You are, Utad broke off, and Finan grinned. And they walked on, laughing and trying to forget the immediate future that awaited them in a disease-ravaged homeland. 88,888,888 Trinity was not met with ships to ambush it when she had got to the Berwick coast. Instead, it was an army that waited on the shore. Constantine had brought men, and they walked with Osrith and Trinity's crew back to Osrith's farm estate. This is Alba, and as such needs to be defended, Domhnall told her as they went. You look well, Domhnall, Osrith told him. Found yourself some clothes? Domhnall laughed. The Lady of Bibbenberg was, and then he stopped. What? There was a plague, Osrith, he told her. Your lands seem to be well. You have lost few people, but the Lord Utad has lost his wife. She saw her Christian duty was to clothe and feed me, he added. Osrith knew that she would. That Eadith would have helped him. She had also known all about Eadith, but somehow it felt more real there, in her land again. Her neighbor had died, and she would not be able to recommence her plan to get to know Eadith. It was a pity she was gone. Osrith knew that given longer, she might well have become more amiable towards her. I brought back your ship, Osrith told him. So I see. And you brought an army, she added. No, not an army, Domhnall replied. A few companies who knew that your land had been invaded and felt in their hearts they needed to defend it. I would send them to Bibbenberg to do the same, but, you know, it wouldn't be kind to men who have shown loyalty to get the plague. It was then that Osrith threw her arms around her friend, and gave a brief, gut-wrenching sob. I know, Domhnall told her, stroking the back of her hair. The bastard wouldn't even stand by you two. No, Osrith replied, forcefully. I will not hear anything against Finan. He did stand by me. Aye, well, Domhnall said, as they began to walk again, it will not stop me thinking it. He leaves you here, when this is his land. How could he ever, if he so loves you? He deserves my sword up his old ass, that's what, Domhnall added, with disdain. I would ... I would appreciate it if you were to stay, Osrith said to Domhnall as they got to her farm estate. To be in charge of the fleet? In charge of the army? Yes, Domhnall told her. I will look in on you from time to time. Make sure no Norse have been invited to steal your land. They were here, and all of your men fought with courage. They fought? Osrith replied, in alarm. In a shield wall? In a shield wall, Domhnall told her, with a smile. Every one of your men survived, and that is because of you. You gave them a reason to fight. It is their land. Here is not Alba, she told Domhnall. Here is Berwick, neither Northumbria, neither Alba. Not claimable by Aethelstan. So you believe he is coming then, the king in the south? Yes, Osrith told him. He told me so. He wants Northumbria, and with Guthfrith on the Eofuic throne, no longer a brittle Sigtryggr. There will be war, and destruction. Domhnall reached for her hand for a moment, and she let him take it. Not if Constantine strikes first. There is peace now between he and Owain. Owain has accepted Constantine as overlord. That is something, Osrith told him. That is something. And then, as they neared the farm cottage, guards approached, and others flanked her. In one helmet and mail she recognized Caltigar, who nodded his head to Osrith briefly. Other guards were riding in from further afield, and behind them, two more horse riders. It is the Lord Finan, Caltigar called when he approached his own two scouts and then relayed the information back to Osrith. It was. Domhnall, however, did not move from Osrith's side. I have brought our son back to our land, Finan told Osrith. And this is where you want to be? She asked young Finan. Yes, he told her. For a time. And with my father. You heard the boy, Osrith told Finan, who kissed her with passionate heat, not caring who would be there to see it. Will you be staying long, before you go to stand by Utad's side? We have a new arrangement. Should he need me, to fulfill my oath, he will come to get me, at my home," he added, and looked at Domhnall for a second. He then held out a hand. "I thank you for defending our lands from the Norse. Tell Constantine that I am very grateful." "He will be sending more," Domhnall pointed out. "Oh yes, let him," Finan encouraged. "We cannot have enough of protection." "Now," concluded the Lord of Berwick, "will you and the Mormers kindly join us for supper?" 88,888,888. They had had the best sex they had ever had, the night before Finan had left. In fact every night, now they were settled and content, they humped as if it were their first night. Now Osrith was on her own for the foreseeable future, so she would have to make herself come. She began with her nipples, as she lay in their bed, running her hands over her body and catching them as Finan did with his fingers. She lay with her legs slightly open, so the feelings that would grow when she did finally start to need them did not bring her off too soon, and she reached for them, bringing them up between her thumb and forefinger, adjusting the pressure, the more the better. Constantine had brought that out in her, and she remembered riding him, in Dunn's stables, fantasizing about Domhnall. Then, as the tight feeling of pleasure had begun to build, it was building now, so Osrith opened her legs wider, so that she could delay her orgasm, and reached into her hair to remove her jewel. Its flat metal clip gave just enough pinch to keep the pressure going while she continued to pull and pinch her left nipple and move her right hand down to her cunt. It was Finan's hand she was imagining now, fingering the lips of her, sometimes bobbing his head down to tongue her, sometimes using his index finger and thumb to pinch her clit, and bring it around in circles. When he did that, Osrith's orgasm was never far away, and this time she pushed the thumb knuckle of her right hand at the top of her clit, grinding down on it, as she continued with her nipple, feeling the tingling growing in her hips and along her spine. With one swift movement, she drew her jewel from her nipple, and with her hand, inserted 2 fingers into her cunt, her juices flowing down them and onto the back of her hand. She wasn't done yet, but the pre-cum orgasm, the light, feathery pleasures, were just beginning under her skin. She pushed her fingers inside herself a little deeper, and flexed them, which brought her very quickly to the edge. And then it was back to her clit, that tiny little nub of pleasure that she had perfected the playing with over the course of her life, and she rode her hand, her legs folded for extra pressure, until she came, wave after wave flowing through her body while she rode her hand vigorously, and then stopped, repeating and repeating, drawing her tender nipple up while she did so to get every ounce of pleasure she could out of her own body. When she had finished, she lay back, her breath ragged, her muscles used, her hand still at her cunt while the after-orgasm feeling flowed through her, and her mind drifted to the future. War was coming, and the war would be at home, at Bibbenberg's door, and Utad had to fight himself for the cause he believed in the most, Bibbenberg or Ethelstan. And when he came to ask for Finan, young Finan joined him, and rode between his father and his uncle. But Osrith rode a different path, leaving Berwick in good hands with Mund and Kaltagar. "Berwick is under my protection," he had told Osrith. "They are the lands of my kinsmen, they are your lands. And as with all my lands I will not have them invaded." So Osrith had nodded to the men heading south, to her lands as she rode north to Dunnottar. And it came from Irian, where Osrith had fought for breath against the Northern Sea, where she fought her biggest fight and ended her first pregnancy, where she watched a king buried and one crowned, and a queen marry for happiness as well as for politics, where she taught 2 princesses who grew to be queens themselves, where she had watched the oldest Aryan family, the Uineel, fall apart. The plague in the north had left Sigdrigra dead, and presumably Eadgith, Ethelstan's sister, though another rumour said Sigdrigra had repudiated her, and she had died in a nunnery. Berwick seemed to be spared, but not so Bibbenberg and Eadith. The most skilled healer Osrith knew, had not been able to save herself. And she was angry with herself, that she had not done enough to speak to the woman, who had been no threat to her and Finan, in the end, and she could now do nothing about it. She was angry, too, the tutor had brought with him a slave he had freed. What would have happened if he had arrived at Wittenberg with this slave while Edith had lived? Would he have shamed her and allowed the slave to stay? He was a cunt, Osrith though, and went back to her vow that she would not interest herself other than within the scope of her own lands, and her own people. Aethelstan was now king of the Angles and the Saxons, and from what she had heard had sent messages of friendship to Owain, as his liege lord. So Constantine would have to continue the war, she assumed, and when she thought like this, too many people Osrith knew became involved. So she folded up the manuscript that Edra had given to her and put it away, deep away, with the intriguing thought that she might have been an even bigger landowner. But she would not get involved in an already complicated situation. She had enough, she had Beric. And that was the thought she clung to when, even though she had turned her back on the rest of the country, it had not forgotten her.